What's on your radar, Ryan?
Well, so yesterday you and I talked about the emails that from the NIH that had just been released by Republicans on the House Oversight Committee. And at the time, we were trying to figure out what was precisely new in them. But either way, they painted a damning picture of U.S. government officials wrestling with whether the novel coronavirus may have leaked out of a lab they knew they were funding, deciding that it very well may have, and then actively suppressing those questions. So to spell out what actually is new here, these emails themselves and others similar to it had previously been obtained by news outlets, including The Intercept, which sued the NIH for a huge batch of documents. And the GOP actually cited us in 2 footnotes. These particular emails were first obtained by BuzzFeed and the Washington Post, but the emails were heavily redacted, making it hard to know what was being communicated. A lot of them looked just like that. But as we also know from previous reporting, Republican staff were able to view the full emails, quote, in camera, which basically means they could physically look at them but couldn't take copies with them. So what they did is they quickly took as many notes as they could. It would be better if the NIH would just release them, but this is the best we've got at this point. Now, one quick side note. It's pitiful, it's shameful that Democrats wouldn't collaborate with Republicans on this investigation in any serious way. This shouldn't actually be partisan. It's existentially important that we get the actual truth here. It's obviously too late to stop this pandemic, but maybe not too late to stop the next one. If the NIH and Francis Collins and Anthony Fauci know more than they're telling the public, that's something that should bother anybody from either party or from no party. So what they actually found is quite a big deal. So on February 1st, Anthony Fauci, Collins, and at least 11 other scientists joined a conference call. It's February 11th, 2020. On that call, Fauci and Collins were told the virus might have leaked from the Wuhan lab and might have been genetically engineered. So some context, the day before, Fauci had been warned that it may have been a lab leak, as USA Today reported. Now, the day after the call, Dr. Jeremy Farrar sent around notes, including to Fauci and Collins, summarizing what some of the scientists had said on the call, and that's what's new in this. I want to read directly from some of this because the details are extremely important. So one scientist said he's bothered by the furin site and has a hard time explaining that as an event outside the lab, though there are possible ways in nature, but highly unlikely. So, given above, a likely explanation could be something as simple as passage SARS-CoV-2 in tissue culture on human cell lines under BSL-2 for an extended period of time, accidentally creating a virus that would be primed for rapid transmission between humans via game of furin site from tissue culture and adaptation to human ACE2 receptor via repeated passage. So I think it becomes a question of how do you put all this together, whether you believe in this series of coincidences, what you know of the lab in Wuhan, how much could be in nature, accidental release, or natural event, IM 70-30 or 60-40. And there's this from Dr. Bob Gary. Before I left the office for the ball, I aligned nCoV with the 96% bat CoV sequenced at Wuhan. Except for the RBD, the S proteins are essentially identical at the amino acid level, while all but the perfect insertion of 12 nucleotides that adds the furin site. S2 is over its whole length essentially identical. I really can't think of a plausible natural scenario where you get from the bat virus or one very similar to it to nCoV where you insert exactly 4 amino acids, 12 nucleotide, that all have to be added at the exact same time to gain this function. That, and you don't change any other amino acid in S2? I just can't figure out how this gets accomplished in nature. Do the alignment of the spikes at the amino acid level? It's stunning. Of course, in the lab, it would be easy to generate the perfect 12-base insert that you wanted. Another scenario is that the progenitor of nCoV was a bat virus with the perfect furin cleavage site generated over 3 evolutionary times. In this scenario, rat G13, the WIV virus, was generated by a perfect deletion of 12 nucleotides while essentially not changing any other S2 amino acid. Even more implausible, in my opinion. That is the big if. Okay, so we know that on February 1st and 2nd, the conclusion was that the virus being engineered in the lab was plausible. Indeed, arguably more plausible than not. So later on February 2nd, Francis Collins emails Fauci and colleagues, and the tide begins to turn, and you can start to see politics begin to creep in. Quote, I am coming around to the view that a natural origin is more likely. But I share your view that a swift convening of experts in a confidence-inspiring framework, WHO seems really the only option, is needed, or the voices of conspiracy will quickly dominate, doing great potential harm to science and international harmony, unquote. So Dr. Ron Fortier sent an email making the same point, saying that, quote, further debate about such accusations would unnecessarily distract top researchers from their active duties and do unnecessary harm to science in general and science in China in particular, unquote. 2 days later, Fauci and Collins got a draft article being prepared by the scientists called The Proximal Origins of SARS-CoV-2. The draft paper is still secret, and all we have is Fauci's reply, which seems to be a scientific version of WTF. He typed 2 question marks, followed by, quote, serial passage in ACE2 transgenic mice, unquote. So now, the logical conclusion here is that the paper included serial passage as a possibility, and Fauci was flagging it as noteworthy one way or another. That theory does appear in the final version of the Nature letter. A hypothetical generation of SARS-CoV-2 by cell culture or animal passage would have required prior isolation of a progenitor virus with very high genetic similarity, which has not been described. Subsequent generation of a polybasic cleavage site would have then required repeated passage in cell culture or animals with ACE2 receptors similar to those of humans, but such work has also not previously been described, unquote. That's how they dismiss it at the end. If Fauci or Collins made substantive edits, this appears to be where they put their pen the heaviest, allowing animal passage to be raised, but immediately dismissing it as having not previously been described. So Republicans also released an email from Jeremy Farrar saying, Eddie Holmes, 64 lab, I am 50-50. So on February 4th, the day they got the paper, key scientists still believed the lab theory was plausible, which makes it impossible for Fauci to claim something major changed between the 1st and the 4th. Francis Collins, in an email, then called the paper a, quote, very thoughtful analysis, arguing against engineering, but repeated passage is still an option. In other words, they're arguing that it wasn't deliberately constructed in a lab, but an experiment that involved repeated passage between animals was still possible. From there, the trail goes cold in the emails, and the paper that is eventually published rejects the idea that it originated in a lab. Fauci cited the paper in tamping down the theory.
Peter Daszak, who you communicated with privately, and other members of the scientific community that wrote opinion pieces for Nature. 5 of them signed a paper for Nature, an opinion piece. 17 signed a paper that called it conspiracy theory, the idea that the virus could have originated in the lab. Do you think words like conspiracy theory should be in a scientific paper?
Senator, I never used that word when I was referring to it. You're distorting virtually everything.
Did you communicate with the 5 scientists who wrote the opinion piece in Nature where they were describing, oh, there's no way this could have come from the lab?
That was not me. What I did.
Did you talk with any of those scientists privately?
You keep distorting the truth. It is stunning.
So while the mainstream media blackballed the topic, people kept pushing. Francis Collins in April emailed Anthony Fauci a link to a segment by Bret Baier, who noted that people still wondered about that lab. Of course, one thing Collins could have done is actively explored the question and searched for truth, but by April, Fauci and Collins had settled on their story, and Fauci told him to ignore it and assured him it would all go away. Quote, I would not do anything about this right now. It is a shiny object that will go away in times. That was not true.
Right. No, he was wrong.
Went away for a long time.
Brilliant political instincts from Dr. Fauci. No, it's that absolutely did not turn out to be the case, and partially because the evidence just, despite their best efforts, I mean, I think one of the things you pointed out is that Fauci cited that paper to tamp down on the theory, which was, of course, the point, but it is a completely corrupt process, literally manipulating scientific papers for political ends. And that Collins email that was just up, he talks about this is a destructive conspiracy theory that threatens international harmony. international harmony. And so you see that their motivations are not purely scientific, as Dr. Fauci would have you believe. There are all kinds of politics. And the other thing I would note is that date, February 4th. February 4th, as you said, what changed between the 1st and the 4th, we don't know. It seems likely that nothing did. But February 4th, 2020, February 4th, 2022 is the day that the Beijing Olympics begin. So 2 years to the day, we're
International harmony.
International harmony. So I found the sort of that interesting in and of itself, because here we are. But everything you just broke down, I thought was really helpful.
And what's obnoxious about this whole conversation is how partisan it has become, and needlessly so, because there's nothing structural or fundamental about the question of where the virus originated that necessarily requires Republicans to believe one thing and Democrats to believe another thing.
Right.
Like,
what's the China question, right?
Right, but for them it was, they talk about international harmony, but I think what they mean underneath that is the harmony of their scientific research funding flows.
Yeah, the WHO, yes.
Right, Fauci was furious about the pause in gain-of-function research. Fauci knew that they had been funding this type of research through EcoHealth Alliance in Wuhan. Even at the height of this, wasn't reflecting on whether or not gain of function is something that should be paused. Mm-hmm. Like, he thinks, and he has said this publicly, that it's just misinformation, that people are confused about the value of gain of function and the wisdom of it.
and the definition of it, of course.
And so that's right. So that's the harmony, mm-hmm. and that they're really talking about. And for all of these Democrats who are concerned about who were concerned about the lab leak getting discussed, they don't have any interest in defending gain of function. Like, they weren't
right.
even thinking through, like, what's their material connection to this question. It just became a culture war question, to the point where everyone on one side just was on, believing one set of things, and then everybody on the other side was believing the other.
The media has played, I think, an absolutely shameful role in all this as well. Granted, after a while, there was a long New York Magazine piece that came out talking about the lab leak theory that really got people to take it seriously again. But for the better part of a year, they were following Fauci's lead, and he was manipulating them, intentionally manipulating them. And you can see it in the emails. They're talking about media strategy. I mean, come on. And they're actually, again, using papers, scientific papers, to deal with the media. And so the media's role in allowing them to get away with that for the better part of a year, and even longer, depending on what the source is, because they seemed to be anti-Trump. And Fauci had that moment for a couple of months. But even then, when he was, saying nice things about Donald Trump, everyone thought it was sort of like wink and a nod, right? Like, he was, the Trump whisperer. And so because he was against Trump, the media couldn't do its job of calling balls and strikes. And that, I think, is also what pushed everyone into their individual corners. Right,
because I would love to hear kind of impartial, scientific-minded people talking, grilling Fauci about this.
Absolutely.
Who just want to get to the bottom of it. I am glad that Rand Paul is pursuing it, but he can only take it so far because of who he is.
Right.
He needs somebody with scientific credibility across the board to say, no, like that, these answers are not going to fly. You can't just make this a personal war between me and you.
Well, that's, like you said, Fauci wants to make it into a dogfight. The exchange that you just played, you hear him, Rand Paul didn't say that Fauci referred to it as a conspiracy theory, and Fauci is saying, I didn't refer to it as a conspiracy. Like, he's intentionally arguing past the point. But I think, sadly, everybody is too sort of tarred or burdened by the partisan labels now to actually serve as a sort of neutral scientific arbiter, because somehow, some way, we always find a way to not we, but the people in the media and in our politics always find a way to take sides.
Right, indeed. But we will have more Rising right after this.